Have you read or seen a news story lately that said something along the lines of new study finds genetic component linked to some outcome like depression or substance use? We all know that physical traits like height, hair color, eye color, etc. are strongly determined by our genes. But what about behavioral traits like aggression or psychological disorders? Do these have a genetic component? And if so, how do researchers know? This is where the science of behavioral genetics comes in. Behavioral genetics is a science of how our genes and our environments work together to influence behavior. Let's look first at the different types of study designs that researchers might use to determine the relative influence of genes versus environment on a given outcome. Perhaps you share some physical traits with biological family members. For example, maybe you have your dad's eyes or your mother's same facial structure. Here is a picture of the famous actress Reese Witherspoon and her daughter. You can definitely see the physical resemblance. Partly, this is due to the fact that Reese's daughter shares about 50% of her DNA with her mother. The gene that makes Reese's hair look blonde can be passed down biologically to her daughter, causing her hair to look blonde in turn as well. In the same way, if a certain behavioral trait such as aggression is inherited, then we would expect that offspring should be similar to their biological parents and other biological family members on that particular trait. However, when looking at behavior, it's not just that simple. Physical traits like hair color, eye color, and facial structure are usually not going to be strongly influenced by environmental factors. However, behavioral traits like aggression might be. Thus, for children who are raised by their biological parents, similarity on any behavioral trait, such as aggression, intelligence, or political orientation, could be due to genetic factors, that is, the shared genes with their biological parents, but it could also be due to the many experiences that the child has shared with that family growing up. In other words, genetics and experience are confounded. They could both potentially be a cause of the similarity in behavior between parents and offspring, so we can't really tell the relative influence of either. This means that scientists in the field of behavioral genetics need to use specially designed studies to try and disentangle or separate the relative potential influence of genes versus environment on a particular outcome. Let's look now at a couple of those different kinds of study designs. The first kind of study that researchers might use is called an adoption study. This is where, with everyone's full knowledge and consent, researchers compare children who have been adopted with both their adopted and biological parents on a particular trait. In this scenario, genes and environment are no longer confounded. Adopted children inherited their genetic material from their biological parents, but their postnatal environment was primarily determined by their adopted family. Thus, if on average adopted children more closely resemble their adopted parents on some trait, then we would conclude that perhaps one's environment, which was determined by their adoptive family, had a stronger influence on that particular outcome. If, however, on average, adopted children still more closely resembled their biological parents, that would indicate that perhaps genetics might be playing a stronger role. For example, one surprising study found that the body weight of adopted children more closely resembled their biological versus adopted parents, even though the adopted parents presumably had much more control over their adopted child's diet. Of course, this isn't to say that our weight is simply predetermined or that diet or exercise have no impact on our health outcomes. However, it does indicate that genetics may have an important role to play here too. Another type of study that researchers in this field might use is called a twin study. To understand how this works, we first need to understand that there are two kinds of twins, identical and fraternal. In identical twins, there is only one fertilized egg, called a zygote, that splits into two during the normal cell division and multiplication process. For this reason, identical twins are sometimes called monozygotic twins, where mono is a root meaning one, so monozygotic simply means that they both came from one single zygote. Because of this, identical or monozygotic twins are genetically identical. They share 100% of their DNA and thus will look exactly alike. In fraternal twins, in contrast, two eggs are released and fertilized at the same time. Hence, fraternal twins are sometimes called dizygotic twins because they came from two separate zygotes. Fraternal twins share on average about 50% of their DNA and are no more genetically similar or different than ordinary siblings. However, because fraternal twins were born at the same time, and thus presumably share more of their environmental influences, including their prenatal environment, they're a better comparison for identical twin pairs than other pairs of siblings. In twin studies, the researchers can compare the similarity of identical twin pairs, who share 100% of their DNA, versus the similarity of fraternal twin pairs, who only share on average about 50% of their DNA. If a trait has a genetic component, who do you expect would be more similar on average? Let's look at a real example. Researchers studying schizophrenia have compared the concordance rate for identical versus fraternal twins. A concordance rate is how likely it is that both twins will be the same on a given outcome. For example, if one twin develops schizophrenia, a high concordance rate means that there's a high likelihood that the other twin will develop it as well. Let's look at just the bottom two bars of this graph. What do you notice? The concordance rate for identical twin pairs here for schizophrenia is just under 50%. So if one identical twin develops schizophrenia, that means there's a pretty high probability the other twin will as well. In contrast, the concordance rate for fraternal twin pairs is much lower at around only 20%. Because identical twins share more of their DNA than fraternal twins and are more similar on this particular outcome, that is, they have a higher concordance rate, then it's likely that the greater similarity in the outcome is the result of the greater similarity in their genetics. In other words, the results from this study suggest that genes play an important role in the onset of schizophrenia. A quick caveat though. In this slide, we see that the concordance rate for schizophrenia among identical twin pairs is just under 50%. While this indicates that genes likely play a significant role in the onset of this illness, it's also not 100%. In other words, there are many cases where one identical twin will go on to develop schizophrenia and the other will not, even though they share 100% of their DNA. What can explain this? For that, we need to turn to gene by environment interactions. The question of nature-nurture is often framed as a debate between the two, nature versus nurture, as if they're two completely separate forces competing for influence over your behavior. However, this idea has turned out to be too simplistic. This is because both nature and nurture interact or combine in interesting and surprising ways, and we call these gene by environment interactions. For example, I mentioned the earlier study looking at genetic influences on body weight, and I feel like I have some personal experience with this. I discovered recently that I have insulin resistance, which makes it very easy for me to gain weight, especially in my midsection, and my mom has some insulin resistance as well. It's likely that she passed on some genes to me that placed me at greater risk of developing this particular outcome. And now, if I eat a lot of carbs and sweets, I gain weight pretty quickly. In contrast, my roommate can eat just about whatever she wants and still be a size extra small. This is probably due in part, at least, to some differences in our genetics. However, this doesn't mean that I can't do anything about my insulin resistance. I've learned a lot about carbs and sugar recently, and I found that this has given me greater control to choose foods and exercise that have been really beneficial for my body, and even reduced my A1C a little bit, which is a measure of how much sugar has been recently floating around in my blood. So do my genes matter more here, or my environment? In reality, both matter quite a bit, and both work together to influence my adult body weight. Other research has found similar findings for the onset of psychological disorders such as depression. For example, one famous study by Avshalom Caspi and colleagues looked at how both genes and environment can contribute to the likelihood of developing depression. They found that certain individuals, represented in this graph by the top blue line, had a genetic risk factor that increased their likelihood of developing depression. Specifically, they had a variant of a certain gene that affects serotonin production. Remember, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is thought to be involved in mood regulation. However, it wasn't just that simple. In the absence of any negative life experience, those individuals were no more likely to develop depression than those without this genetic risk factor. It was only when people had had several negative past life experiences that those with the genetic risk factor actually appeared to be at greater risk of going on to develop depression. In other words, it wasn't just someone's genes or just their environment, rather both mattered together. Recent research has taken this one step further and shown that our genes and our environments can actually change and shape each other too. On the one hand, your genetic makeup might make it more likely that you seek out certain kinds of environments. For example, someone with a genetic predisposition for extroversion might seek out more social stimulation. And surprisingly, environments can also change our genes, or at least how they're being expressed. This is called the science of epigenetics, and it looks at how our genes can actually be turned on or turned off by our environmental input. This is one way that identical twins may go on to diverge on certain outcomes, even though they share 100% of their DNA. If they have had different life experiences, then this can lead to differences in what is called their epigenome, or how their genes are being expressed. So even though both twins still have the exact same genes, those genes might not be expressing themselves in the exact same way, leading to divergent outcomes. For example, researchers have found that after spending 1 year in space, Scott Kelly's gene expression differed by about 7% from his identical twin Mark. Scott's genes themselves didn't actually change, just the way they were being expressed. Scott and Mark still share 100% of their DNA, but their epigenome is different. The exciting takeaway from this is that, again, we aren't completely at the mercy of our genetic makeup, so to speak. You can actually change things about your epigenome by changing certain environmental inputs like the foods you eat or the amount of stress that you're regularly exposed to. For a great video that nicely explains how epigenetics works, as well as some recent research findings in that area, you can check out the supplemental TED Talk video on Canvas. In this video, we discussed different study designs used in behavioral genetics, as well as gene by environment interactions. For the exam, you should be able to define and distinguish between twin and adoption studies, explain how twin and adoption studies allow us to determine the relative influence of genes versus environment on a particular outcome, explain what is meant by gene by environment interactions, and define epigenetics.